This is a discussion of Emily Dickinson's poem, "This is My Letter to the World." I will display the text of the poem and play a recording of Alexandra O'Connor reading it. Then I will present my commentary on the poem. After my commentary, I will play a recording of another reader, Julie Harris, reading the poem. At the very end, I will display the references to the scholarly works I have mentioned in the commentary.
This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me, the simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me.
Dickinson wrote around 1,800 poems, but only 10 or so of them were published in her lifetime. She sent some of her poems to 2 influential editors, but neither liked them very much. The only person who did recognize Dickinson's genius when she was alive was Helen Hunt Jackson. Although almost no one reads her now, at the time Jackson was known as America's foremost female writer. Jackson implored Dickinson to find a publisher, but Dickinson was discouraged by repeated rejection. I think Dickinson preferred to craft her art in solitude, hoping perhaps that somehow she would be known after her death, but not counting on it. Dickinson's poems are brutally honest and utterly without pretense. They are completely unlike what the editors she consulted considered to be good poetry. Maybe Dickinson figured that she could not be true to herself if she had to defer to prevailing conventions. This poem might be an example of a sophisticated literary device called an envoi, like the French envoyer, which means a sending forth. It has been used by poets from Chaucer to Ezra Pound. You send forth a poem or a letter or a book into the future. This poem, this letter to the world, is sent into the future with the hope that Emily Dickinson's poetry will finally be recognized. Like much of 19th century poetry, this poem is drenched in Christian religious language. Take the word letter, for instance. The word for letter in New Testament Greek is epistle, as in the Epistle to the Corinthians or Epistle to the Romans. According to Helen Vendler, Dickinson says that she is sending this letter, this epistle, out to future generations. It brings the news, in line 3, to future generations. News is a reference to the word gospel, which means good news in the Greek of the New Testament. Note the word nature in line 3 of the poem. For us, nature has to do with trees and flowers, but to the children of the Enlightenment, such as Thomas Jefferson, it was a loaded term signifying a lax and almost agnostic orientation toward the idea of God. Jefferson used the term nature's God in the Declaration of Independence, which is puzzling to us, but to Jefferson it meant that although there was a God, he operated only through the immutable laws of nature. This was quite different from the Calvinism of Dickinson's contemporaries, whose God was present everywhere, even in the most minute details of everyone's life. Nature is personified as female, which explains the pronoun her in lines 5 and 7. Jefferson lived several generations before Dickinson, but this definition of nature was still current around the time Dickinson wrote this poem, around 1862. Although most of the townspeople she lived among were devout Protestants, descendants of the original American Puritans, Dickinson herself never joined the church. This was unusual for someone living in her society. What was this news that nature told of? David Priest thought that it meant that nature would bring about Dickinson's own rebirth through her poetry. What is meant by hands I cannot see in line 6? William Shore thought that it meant that someone in the future would do for Dickinson what, for instance, Robert Browning did for his wife Elizabeth, that is, to make Elizabeth Browning's poems known to the world. Dickinson adored Elizabeth Browning's poems. She hung a picture of Elizabeth Browning on her bedroom wall and was aware that Robert Browning was the person who made his wife's poems known to the world. But the person who did this for Dickinson was not a husband or a lover or a future scholar, but the most unlikely person you can imagine, her brother's mistress, Mabel Loomis Todd. Dickinson's brother Austin used Emily Dickinson's house for a long-term adulterous affair with Todd. Both were married to other people. Austin and Mabel met in Emily's house to have sex several times a week over a period of nearly 10 years. Emily's house belonged legally to Austin, so he could do what he wanted. But Emily Dickinson stubbornly refused to come out of her bedroom to meet Todd. The first time Mabel laid her eyes on Emily was when Emily was laid out in an open casket. After Emily Dickinson's death, a trove of her poems was discovered in the house. Todd painstakingly deciphered Dickinson's handwriting and, with the help of a few others, delivered Dickinson's poems to future generations. Without Todd, we probably would not have the poetry of America's greatest 19th century poet.
This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me the simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me.